Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this talk from the Russell Sage Foundation on our Dissertation Research Grants program, our best practices, and how to apply for a grant from us. My name is Eric Bias, and I'm a program associate with Russell Sage. I'm joined by my colleagues, Stephen Glauser and Deandra Durand. If you'd like to introduce yourself, guys.
Sure. My name is Stephen Glauser, and I'm a program officer at the foundation.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Deandra Durand. I'm the program assistant.
And you can go to the next slide, Stephen. So before we start, I'm going to introduce a few housekeeping notes. If you have to leave during the middle of the talk for whatever reason, rest assured that the meeting is being recorded and will be hosted on our website shortly afterward. If you have any kind of questions during the talk, please use the Zoom's Q&A function as opposed to the chat. It's just a bit easier for us to keep track of and make sure which one's been answered and which one hasn't. Also, and very importantly, please do refrain from asking any kind of specific questions during the talk about your potential project. We recommend that if you have any kind of specific project-related questions, you just email us after the talk or during at programs@rsage.org. Next slide, please. So for a little bit of history, the Russell Sage Foundation was actually founded by the wife of Russell Sage, Margaret Olivia Sage, more than 100 years ago in 1907 for the improvement of social and living conditions in the United States. Before World War II, we were focused on a lot of different things that were specific to the United States, like labor reform, housing, and public health. But post-World War II, we transitioned to mostly focusing on social science research and making sure that we push that research forward in terms of advancement.
I would like to give a quick overview of the program areas that we have here at the foundation. So these are the areas that we fund mostly academic research in across a variety of social science disciplines. So we often see projects from economics, sociology, psychology, political science. Less often, but they still come through from anthropology or history, where they interact with the social sciences. But these program areas are the first one is on behavioral science and decision making and context. Just a couple of years ago, this would have been known as behavioral economics, but we wanted to sort of show that the behavioral sciences aren't just for economists, and so that sort of anything looking at those sorts of questions we have under that bucket. The next one is on the future of work. Russell Sage has had a program on the future of work since, I believe, 1994. We like to say that we were doing it before it was cool. But here, any questions that have to do about labor rights, labor economics, questions about automation, questions about care work, the aging work population, anything that has to do with labor really will go under the future of work. I would like to note that you may have seen on our website that it is possible that this year projects that come in that have to do with anything to do with labor and employment might be co-funded with the Upjohn Institute for Employment in Michigan. I'll make a note that the only difference in those projects is that half of the funding might come from Upjohn and half might come from Russell Sage, but the review process is going to be identical. And if you are awarded a grant, the Upjohn Institute will invite you to give a seminar at their headquarters, and that will be they will cover the expenses for that. But other than that, the entire review process is the same. So everything we're going to go over the rest of this talk is identical. Next, we have a program on race, ethnicity, and immigration. These used to be separate. We used to have one on cultural contact that really covered issues of race, and one on immigration, but we've combined these two because we've seen that a lot of the questions that come in are related. We currently have a special initiative on immigration and immigrant integration that is co-funded with the Carnegie Corporation. That's sort of like we're just really showing that we would like to see questions about integration as well. It's sort of if the larger program area is like a rectangle, this is like a square. They're both related. They're both the same. We'll rely on the same people to review it, et cetera. And then finally, we have a program on inequality. It used to just be called social inequality, but again, to sort of show the inclusiveness across the different disciplines that we want to see applied to this program, we now refer to it as our social, political, and economic inequality program. All of these programs have RFPs that are listed on our website, and those RFPs are, what does that stand for? Request for proposals. Those have example research questions that are the types of things that we'd like to see. These RFPs are not meant to be all-inclusive. They obviously do not cover every sort of topic and question in these areas that we would be interested in. It's just sort of like a starting point where you can go look at them and be like, oh, I'm interested in this. Maybe this is something that the foundation would be interested in funding. So we really recommend you go take a look at those RFPs, and you can get a good idea of where your question fits and if it's something that the foundation would be interested in. I'll talk a little bit specifically about this upcoming deadline for the Dissertation Research Grants. We have one deadline a year, and this year it's February 1st. If everything goes well, we intend to have funding available to the grantees by this summer. So we have these one-year grants of up to $10,000. You can see some of the budget categories here. These are not, again, similarly, not all inclusive, but these are the ones that are definitely allowable, and there are other ones that are allowed on a case-by-case basis. Up to half of the award can be like a direct payment, a stipend of up to $5,000. This is we recognize that as grad students, you need to pay rent and other things like that. And so up to half of this award can just be for, you don't even have to allocate it. It can just be for your own use. But other things that can be used, like it can be used for research assistance. It can be used for participant incentives. It can be used to buy access to data. It can be used for things like transcriptions, lab costs, travel for that data collection. All of those things are perfectly fine to include or to plan on using. I will note, and we'll go over this later, that you don't need to include a budget at the time of application, but it's a good idea to have. It's nice to have an idea of what the funding can actually be used for. I would also like to note that RSF usually doesn't fund work that concentrates on health outcomes. And the way that I'll say that is, if the health outcome is the main outcome, that means we're less likely to be interested in it. This is mostly because there's a lot of other funders out there who really do fund health outcomes. But if the health outcomes are one among many outcomes, including labor market outcomes, educational outcomes, various political participation outcomes, or any other sort of things, it's one among many, then we could still be interested in it. Or if it's sort of like the impact of something like health on economic inequality, or health on labor market access, or something like that. So if health is on the other side of the equation, we could also still be interested in it. And then similarly, we don't usually fund educational studies looking at things like curriculums, educational processes, teacher outcomes. We are interested in educational studies that look on student outcomes, particularly as they get closer to entering the labor market. So sort of like educational attainment in high school or college. But that is to say, it doesn't mean that a project looking at those other things won't ever be funded at the foundation. It just means that it has to be very well matched to the rest of our priorities. And this is one of those things where if you have a question about where your project sits here, feel free to email us and be like, hey, here's what I'm studying. Would this be something that we're interested in? And then we can actually take a look at your abstract or something like that and give you a better idea of whether the foundation is a good match for you.
So I'm going to go over a number of points with regards to eligibility. If you are a doctoral student that is enrolled in a US-based institution of higher education, then you are eligible. It doesn't matter if you are not a US citizen, as long as you are enrolled at a US-based institution, then you should be fine. In terms of your program requirements, you have to have your district, you have to be at the ABD status of your studies. Essentially, you have your exams finished, everything except the dissertation, and you should be fine to apply as well. One point that you need to consider is that your dissertation research has to be approved by your committee And your dissertation advisor has to document that the research that you're being conducted for an RSF grant is the same as what is outlined in the proposal that you gave to us. And that's something that we'll ask like later on in the process. That's not something you necessarily need to worry about when you initially apply. Another point, only one dissertation research grant is allowed per applicant. And something really important, we really encourage applications from scholars who are traditionally underrepresented in the social sciences. So if you are a first-gen scholar, if you come from an HBCU, if you come from a non-R1 institution, we really recommend that you apply. And if you are fully funded for the proposed grant period on a departmental, university, or national fellowship, we want to note that your application is less likely to be externally reviewed. Doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be likely, won't be reviewed, but we want to prioritize applicants who don't have the time or the resources to complete their research. If you have a teaching or research assistantship, your application will also still be possibly externally reviewed. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this earlier, but when you submit your application, you only really need to submit the application form in our grants management platform, which is Flux, a 5-page max single-spaced proposal. You don't need to include, you don't need to worry about tables or figures as long as it's 1 page. It doesn't count towards those 5 pages. And a CV, 5 pages max. That's all you need to include. Later on, if you receive positive reviews, we'll ask for a letter of recommendation from your dissertation supervisor, a budget with our budget templates on Excel, a budget narrative, and yeah, okay, cool. And your project timeline, an organization confirmation letter from your institution, confirmation of IRB approval if it's applicable, and also similarly access to data and confirmation of your pre-registration. Next slide.
All right, I'll talk a little bit about how this timeline plays out. So the deadline for application is on February 1st. As Eric mentioned, we would like you to be at the ABD stage. If you have not yet defended your dissertation, this was a question that popped up in the Q&A already, you can still apply as long as you will have defended it by the time that funds are supposed to be released. Before we release any funds, we would ask for proof of that. So ahead of the February 1st deadline, we would recommend that you go onto our Flux system and pre-register, because we have to approve people to apply, and that can sometimes lead to a couple delays, and we don't want any panicked emails on the day of. After you submit, the first thing that happens is it will go through an internal review here by program staff at the foundation. We're mostly a mix of, I will say, former social scientists, or we at this point have no one is an expert on anything anymore here at the foundation, because we read so broadly across different areas. So you have a team of generalists who are sort of going to read your project, and what we're looking for is like how well does this fit for the foundation's priorities, and then we are also matching it to who we think would be good external reviewers. A good number of these projects will not move forward, and we'll go over why that might happen later. But the ones that do move forward will get reviewed by a number of interdisciplinary experts in the field. We're often matching these based on topic fit to your project and also methodological fit. So if you're proposing a survey experiment, we're going to ask someone who knows about survey experiments to evaluate your project. Those peer reviews come in, and we, together with our advisory committee, make decisions on which ones should be funded we're hoping by early May. And that will give us enough time to do all of the due diligence necessary to get funding out the door by July 1. It's a good idea. These are the questions that we ask our external reviewers. And so if you sort of take a look at these ideas, it can give you a good idea of what to include in your proposal. We're really asking them, is this an interesting and compelling research question? Are these sort of, are they appropriately grounded in prior theory and empirical work? And then are the research design data and methods appropriately matched to the questions that you're posing? If you're proposing to look at if something is causal or not, do you have sufficient power to answer that question? If you're just doing something descriptive or qualitative, we're not really looking for a power calculation, obviously. But we are asking that, like, that the question is well matched to the research design. Then we're asking them, has this investigator been properly trained? Can they do this? Have they ever done things like this before? Or is this something completely out of left field to them? And we're primarily getting that from your CV. And then finally, like, what is the contribution of this project going to be? And that's sort of taken in two ways. Like, is it going to marginally move the literature forward at least, or is it something that's already been done before? But also, what is the contribution to the applicant's career? Or sort of like, is this a good project? Is this likely to result in a successful PhD defense, et cetera, et cetera? And then we also ask them to sort of give any other notes that we think would help strengthen the project. And these can be notes on sampling. This can be notes on, oh, why don't you think about asking your questions this way? Or have you thought about this? Or, oh, you should actually read a little bit more of the literature in this space that maybe you didn't cite or you didn't know about, that can give you a little bit more information. So that we find that can often be helpful for folks.
All right, so if you are declined at the initial screen or given what's known as a desk reject, there are usually a couple of reasons that we give in our automated email for the reasons why. And I'm just going to give a little bit of context as to what those mean. If it's, for instance, quote, not an RSF funding priority, end quote, it could mean that your project isn't focused on the US or that it's not really focused on the social sciences. It could be routine analysis of what's known as, or what we call routine analysis of existing publicly available data using the GSS, PSID, or others. And that basically just means that if you're doing some kind of simple regression or simple work like that, then that's not something we would necessarily fund. Further, we don't fund as a foundation operational support or program evaluations or animal studies or things like that. We're really just focused on social science research first and foremost. If your project is flagged as not having sufficient detail, we would really prefer that you place a stronger emphasis on your research questions, design, methodology. Sometimes folks don't use the full number of pages on an application that's given to them. They maybe limit this just maybe 3 pages when you could have used 2 extras, or you include a lot of extra information that we don't necessarily need. Like, for instance, we don't necessarily need a couple paragraphs on your investigator qualifications because we can get that from your CV. We would also want your lit review to consider multiple disciplines since we're an interdisciplinary foundation. So if you are, say, an economist, we want you to take into account that maybe a sociologist will look at your application as well. So try to get a little bit of a handle on the literature on sociology as opposed, or in addition to economics when you're fleshing out your lit review. Some other possible reasons include a lack of clarity or vagueness in your research design and your narrative. We want to make sure that the data and the methods that you're outlining in your proposal are suitable for the research that you're hoping to carry out. Similarly, we want you to include a very strong descriptive or causal design. If your project is making a causal claim, we want it to be designed in such a way that it's sure that it can actually answer the questions that you're trying to pose. And if you're also receiving a very large amount of outside support, it's less likely that we'll review your project or pass it on for funding, just because we have a limited amount of funds that we want to give out, and we want to make sure that it's given out to folks that need it more. Next slide. So some general tips and suggestions, some of which I already touched upon. We want you to make sure that your project is a fit with the foundation's funding priorities. You don't have to have a necessary connection to multiple ones, but if it's got a connection to at least one, that's perfectly welcome and acceptable and desired. If your research questions drive the proposal, then that's a good sign for you. We want you to map your research design, your data and methods very tightly to your research questions. We don't want to necessarily have it the other way around, in which you have this really great data set that you want to do some kind of study on, but you don't really have a fleshed out research question that goes with that research. We want you to balance proposal narrative. Like I mentioned, paragraphs on the investigator qualifications aren't necessarily something you want to put in a narrative or your application. We want you to provide sufficient information for reviewers to evaluate the appropriateness of the methods that you're attempting to use for your project. We don't want you to overpromise or exaggerate what the project will do. Again, don't use causal language if you don't have a causal design, like I mentioned. And we want you to also outline some of the strengths and limitations of the design methods and analysis you're proposing. It doesn't have to be necessarily perfect, but we want you to acknowledge that there could be a potential issue with whatever you're attempting to propose. If you're asked to respond to reviews, if you get to that stage, please take these reviews seriously, graciously, and in depth. You have virtually unlimited space, within reason, of course, to answer any kind of concerns or questions that a reviewer will have on your proposal. So we want you to take that space and make the most of it that you possibly can. If you get necessarily negative critiques, just try to engage with those critiques as graciously as possible. You don't necessarily even have to agree with these folks. You can just stand your ground when you're completing your evaluations of those reviews. Just try to flesh them out as much as possible and be as constructive as possible. Our website is a resource. We want you to check it out as much as possible. There's FAQs, there's example LOIs and proposals and applications. If you have any kind of questions about guidelines or deadlines, check the website first, because chances are that question is there and fully fleshed out for you. And I think Stephen mentioned this also, but please do register for our Flux portal at least 2 days in advance, because all these registrations are handled manually by staff, and sometimes before a deadline, it can get a little bit bogged down. So we always ask, if you're intending to apply to us, do so even now, right after this webinar. It doesn't really hurt you at all if you do it earlier than you think. And last but not least, we do have many, many good proposals. Like for this particular program with one deadline per year, we'll probably get way more than we can possibly fund. So if you don't make it, do try again. If not for the DRG, then from one of our other programs.
And just quick before I move on to the next slide, I'll really, I know we have it highlighted in red here, but we do have example proposals, LOIs for our other funding programs. Those are often for folks who already have their PhDs, who are professors, assistant professors, et cetera, applying to us. But we do specifically have a couple dissertation research grants proposals as well. But the idea is that you can sort of glean the amount of detail and the amount of what the sort of even how people construct their proposals, and it can actually really be helpful. So highly recommend that you check out those example proposals across all of the different funding opportunities that we have, and you'll probably be able to learn something from them. And I would like to, this is for mostly for this audience of people who are still grad students. We do have some other ways that you can sort of connect with the foundation. The first one is our open access journal. You can see all of the past issues at rsfjournal.org. We have links to data sets that we've funded and are publicly available, and that's also available for you. And we occasionally have summer institutes that often have eligibility for grad student researchers, often sort of like farther along, similar to where you would be if you're applying for a dissertation grant. You might be interested in one of these. Their deadlines are usually in the early spring. I think the only one that we're really hosting this year, Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the Institute on Migration Research Methods. And I think that's all that we have formally, but I will start going through and answering some questions that I saw come up a few different times. And so the first is sort of on that timeline. There are some questions on after you apply, how long before you'll hear back, both from the initial screen, but then also even if you find out that you get funded, how long before you have to like submit all of those other materials, like your budget and your IRB approval, et cetera. So first, we try to do that internal screen pretty quickly. You should probably hear back from us within, I would say, hopefully like 6 weeks after application. You'll know, even sooner actually. Might even we will probably push to within a month. You should know if you made that external review screen. Then when we make final funding decisions in May, then you sort of have 2 months from that early May until a goal of a July 1 start date. It's okay if you are okay with it having a delayed start date, like if you don't want your project to start until September or something like that. We just have found that most people want to get a lot of the work done this summer. So that July 1st is our goal start date. But if you have to delay it for other reasons, that's also, we're also fine with that. I think some other questions I have were about eligibility. And essentially, if you are all but ABD right now, that's great, and your proposal's already been approved. That's awesome. If you are sort of defending that later and it'll be approved before funding is released, that's also fine. So you're allowed to apply if you are not yet at that stage, but we won't release it if you do get. If we decide that you're going to be one of the grantees, we won't release funds until we see that you've actually done that. And we'll do that. Usually, I think we just require a letter from like an email from your advisor that says that you've done this would be enough. And I think there's also a question about if we do give you funding, do we have like a timeline afterwards where you have to defend and everything must be completed? And no, we really don't. We recognize that that these things happen on different timelines. People are doing these things part-time sometimes. No, we just require you to currently be at the ABD stage. If it takes you longer than the 1 year to finish, that's also fine. Eric, do you have any questions that you saw that you might want to answer out loud?
Sure. I've been taking a lot of them on the Q&A, but I can find some. If you are waiting on approval to access secure data but have good reason to believe you will be eligible, would that be okay to submit? I would say sure. We only really need confirmation of data access later on in the process, so I would certainly recommend that you do submit if you have a good reason to believe that you have access to the data or will have access to the data. Let's see. Two questions. Do we fund dissertation projects in a later stage where data collection is complete and the researcher is mostly focusing on analysis and writing? In that case, we would generally shy away from that. We really want you to be completing the research and needing the funds for completion of the research, not necessarily writing. Analysis, that would be fine though. And in case my dissertation is composed of 3 distinct chapters, can I focus on one chapter that's most relevant to your core programs? And should I talk about all the chapters? If you want to focus on one chapter, I think that would be fine. I don't think it's necessary that you have to focus on all the chapters of your dissertation completely as part of your RSF project.
There's a question about balancing like the public impacts of the research versus the how it would move the academic literature forward. I would say the second one is probably a little bit more important to the foundation. We obviously do care if there are policy relevant things or something like that, but in reality, we're mostly interested in, is this advancing the science? So you can include some things about the public impact and why it would be of interest to the public, but this is a point where I would really recommend that you take a look at the example proposals. I saw someone else had earlier said that they were having trouble finding the example proposals. I wonder if, I don't know if Deandra or Eric were able to link them directly to it. I can also clarify, if you've been asked for the second set of information, that generally means that we are probably interested in funding. Like we're only going to ask for more information so that due diligence about IRB approval, other things like that. We're really going to ask that from things that we have a very good chance of being funded from us.
I can take a few more. One question is asking if we only fund projects about the US. Since we're a US focused institution, we only really fund projects that are based on the US. So the answer would be yes. For very, very rare circumstances, we do sometimes look at comparative cases, and we do sometimes very rarely focus with or consider applications that have data sources outside the US, but you have to make a very clear case that you couldn't get data that is talking about a very specific project that's US based unless it's this particular data set that you're considering. In the slides, it says the volume of support you are already receiving can influence your ability to get past the initial screening. And at the application, it says it's asking for confirmed support in which we are applying. How might applying for additional support, is that not yet confirmed, influence the review of applications, the initial screening? What is necessarily considered a large amount of support? I wouldn't really consider that to be something that impedes you from applying. I would certainly do so as well, especially if you're considering, or if you're applying for like pending support and hasn't been granted yet. In terms of a large number of support, I would say, I'm not sure, for most of it, I'd say 75% of your proposed project, if it's already gained that support, I don't know if it would be something that you would necessarily want to apply to us for. Stephen, is there anything you want to
I'm sort of, what we're sort of thinking of there is if you have like a Ford Fellowship already or something like that, like of that scale, it might slant it in some way. That doesn't mean that if you get that, it precludes you from getting a Russell Sage grant, like if you still need extra funds. But really, that's sort of like, the pending support won't really influence at all, because we don't count on you getting the pending support, but it's other sources of confirmed support. If you do get some of the pending support, we will ask you later, and what we'll want to make sure at that point is that sort of the funds from the Russell Sage Foundation are not being used for the same things that the funds from your other source are also being used for. So it's mostly to prevent double dipping is really, and transparency is the best way to deal with that.
Someone is asking, out of the 5-page proposal, how many pages would you recommend spending on things like methodology or literature review, things like that? Generally, yeah, it does depend on the project, but I would say don't include more than 1.5 pages on your lit review, or 1.5 pages, or actually more than a page actually, I probably wouldn't include that much at all on your connection with RSF's program. Aside from that 1.5 pages of lit review, I'd dedicate as much of the rest of the proposal as possible on your methodology, research design, things like that.
And that's really something that looking at some of the example proposals can really help with. Even if you look at some of the other full proposals or LOIs from other program areas and other funding streams, you can sort of see that ratio. Are they spending half of their allotted space on a lit review, or are they spending? In reality, we'd like to see about 50% or more on the method, the data, the methods, the research design. That's really the meat and potatoes of what we care about. Someone is asking about navigating multiple grant applications, like where you're applying to other institutions. Yeah, I sort of alluded to that. Yeah, you can request money from us for the same expense, but sort of as you give us an example later, you can, or as you give us information later, if you do end up getting funding from somewhere else, then we can work with you to adjust the budget or adjust like, oh, hey, I thought I needed money for I guess travel for interviews, but I got funding for that over here. Is it okay if I use this money for something else instead, like transcriptions? That would be fine to edit later. We can always be flexible with you. I hope I answered most of you asking that what looks to be a similar question about if you don't know if you will have that fellowship yet. That's fine. You can just include it as that like pending support, and we'll talk about it later when we actually know more. There's a question about a joint project with you and another ABD student. That's something we haven't really dealt with before. Why don't whoever wrote that in, if you want to send us an email at programs@rsage.org with more information about how you would both be doing your doctorate on the same project. I don't want to say no outright, but it's not something that we've seen before.
Someone was asking who we should list as an organization signatory, financial reporting contact, or grant administration contact in the application portal. When you apply, those are things that you don't necessarily need to worry about with an initial application. Those are personnel that we'll ask for later on in the process. You can get them from your Office of Sponsored Projects. If it doesn't let you go through without putting someone there, you can just put your own name in those fields. But in short, I would not worry about that at all at the initial stage.
Those are all things that we can deal with later. It's sort of required by the application portal, but we can always edit those things later when you find out more. And if we find out if your project's going to be funded or anything like that. Oops. Yes, this is the last question that came up. I was just about to say out loud. If you have any questions that we didn't cover, or if you even just were like, oh, I think they said this, but I just want to clarify, please send it to programs@rsh.org. That email address goes to multiple people here, so we're much more likely to see it. I'll also say that a recording of this is going to be posted either later today or tomorrow on the website, so you will be able to refer back to it. And there's another question. No, funding wouldn't really be for training. It's really funding for the research itself. Mostly the things we're looking at are like access to the data, data collection, and analysis. The tools required to analyze the data are the main things that we're looking for. It's really for the research project. It's not for the training. Although, as I said, like up to half of the amount can be just a stipend, and then you can really do whatever you want with that $5,000. I think we'll probably end pretty soon here. The questions have slowed down, but again, feel free to shoot us emails at programs@rsh.org, particularly if you want a question about if your project is a good fit or not, or if you're like, oh, you mentioned that you sometimes don't, is this what you meant by health outcomes? Is this what you meant by the types of educational curriculum questions that you don't fund? Send us an abstract, just a couple, even if it's just a couple sentences of the project that you're thinking about that can give us a little bit more detail, and we can try to give you a little bit more clarity there. But other than that, thank you all for joining. Oh, there's a quick question on travel costs. Can include those. It depends on travel costs. You just have to. I would again recommend that you send us an email, because this is the sort of thing that really depends. If you're doing qualitative research and you have to be on site, and then something like that might be allowable, but it's on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, thank you all for joining. Please feel free to shoot us an email at programs@rsh.org, and please check out the example questions. Those are the really the main things.
Thanks, everybody.